Hello, welcome to this session, which I'm delighted to be chairing. A new study from German nature reserves reveals a 75% decline in flying insects over the past 27 years. And we're here to ask, among other things, what's the reason for that? What are the implications for farming and the food supply for humanity and for the biosphere? What can be done and why should we care? So I'm joined by Dave Goulson, and I'm going to get them both to introduce themselves in a minute, but briefly, he's Professor of Biology at Sussex University, an entomologist with a particular passion for bumblebees, and David McDonald, the founder of the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at Oxford University. We've got these wildlife and farming books down at the front, which you can take a copy of at the end. Obviously, don't all come and get one now. That would be a disaster. But if you want to pick one of those up at the end, they're free, very kindly from David. Blackwell's at the back have got a number of Dave's books, and there are these two books of David's that can be ordered through Blackwell's, which are very useful for people working on the land and in the field. So my name's Sarah Woods. I'm going to chair this session, and I'm a playwright and activist and teacher. It says on my badge. I work with story across all sorts of different media. I'm currently written an opera for Birmingham Opera. I'm dramatising Das Kapital for Radio 4, and I work a lot with different campaigns and charities. In terms of, oh, my mic's gone. In terms of my work with food and farming, I trained as a commercial horticulturist, and I've worked with Jeff Tansey on the Food Systems Academy, which is an online resource, and also created a module for Lancaster University's Masters in Transforming Food Systems, as well as having had a small holding. So I've got a very small amount of knowledge and understanding, but I wonder, David, if you could introduce yourself and particularly tell us what brought you to your field of work and what you're, in your area of expertise, what you're particularly passionate about at the moment.
Okay, so my name's Dave Goulson. Hello, Katie. So just noticed. I study bumblebees, but I started out, I guess I was just born intrigued by insects. I've been into insects for as long as I can remember. I collected butterflies and stuck pins through them when I was a kid, and have managed to make a living out of studying insects, which I guess I feel pretty lucky about. I moved on from killing butterflies to eventually studying bumblebees, which are fascinating creatures I could talk about all day, but I'll spare you. I actually first got hooked in studying bumblebees because I noticed something weird about when they're visiting flowers. They avoid certain flowers. And it turns out they sniff the flowers, and they can tell ones that have been recently emptied they can smell the smelly footprint of a previous bee landing on the flowers. Anyway, I spent about 5 years studying that. But then I noticed that if you read books about bumblebees from the 70s and 80s, they talked about lots of species that I just couldn't find. They seemed to have disappeared, so I got interested in what had happened to those missing bumblebee species. And then I ended up specializing in kind of causes of bee declines, which is, I guess, something we'll come back to, and that's really what I'm working on at the moment.
Brilliant. And David, the stories I've heard of your early career involve you having fox cubs in your pockets. I'm not sure you've brought any with you today, but is that right?
More or less. I'm David McDonald. I'm the founder, as you kindly say, of the Wild Crew, the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit. And I'm sort of minded to tell you, in answer to the questions of how on earth did I get into this business, stories about a wee boy who loved animals. But considering what we're talking about today, I'll start a bit later and remember my first pay packet, which I still have, which was from my uncle's sheep farm in Dumfries, where I was the assistant shepherd, and my job was to find the so-called cowped yows before the carrion crows found them and turn them up again and get them on their feet. So I have some farming credentials from way back, and until a few years ago, had my own little sheep farm. But how did I get here? I want to tell you a different sort of story. Both Dave and I were undergraduates at Oxford, me 1,000 years or so before him. And an unusual thing, a wonderful thing in a way, happened when I was a student, because I was in the right place at the right time. It was 1969, to see a subject born. And it's a subject that I believe will affect everything we have to say this afternoon and affect the future. It was the coming of age, much of it happened in this university here, of the subjects of animal ecology and animal behavior, which had previously been the wonderful preserve of enlightened natural history, but in the late 60s suddenly took hold as a new scholarly discipline with theories and concepts and patterns of understanding. And I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, to be captivated by the thrill of that emerging topic. Why is it relevant to us now? It's relevant to us now because just as for generations physiology or biochemistry might have informed medicine and the delivery of good to the world, so too the birth of those subjects became the vehicle for informing, providing the evidence for the policies that are conservation. So what in a sense brought me here today was catching that wave of a new subject, a subject that I think underpins much of what this conference is about.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we're going to start just with a little look at where we're at now. And it is a conversation, so I think you can also feel like you could interrupt each other a bit and add to each other in a gentle and kind way, obviously. But I wonder what you both think is the current state of our wildlife. And maybe, do you want to kick off, seeing as David did last time?
Yes. I think the current state of our wildlife, although enriched and invigorated by wonderful discoveries, new ways of thinking, and new arrows in the quiver of conservation provided by people like Dave and a whole community of researchers and thinkers around the world, although that's exciting and exhilarating, the current state of our wildlife in this country and globally is approximately catastrophic. We are losing biodiversity at a rate that is of geological proportions, as you all know. We are losing wilderness, wildlife, and the natural processes that are part of them around the world. And a message that I may, if you'll allow me, come back to later in our conversation is to say many of the same principles that allow us to understand the consequences of those losses, and perhaps a way of thinking about reversing them, are exactly the same principles and exactly the same way of thinking, whether we're concerned with the movements of a moth across a farm in Oxfordshire or a wolf across the hills in Ethiopia. They're the same ecological principles, the same way of thinking, and it's the same understanding that we must bring to bear to inform a new way of thinking and a new sort of policy.
Absolutely, and it's that sort of approach of looking at the patterns and scales of wildlife in our world that we're going to pursue through this session. Dave, is there anything you want to add or elaborate on?
Just to agree, really. We're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction event, as I'm sure everyone is aware, with extinction rates globally running at possibly 100, possibly 1,000 times the historic rate. And we're seeing this massive decline in bioabundance, in the numbers of individual butterflies, birds, whatever it might be. We don't have great data for every wildlife taxa, but Britain is probably better than most, maybe the most studied place in the world, actually, I would guess. And so we have great data for butterflies and moths, both of which are in rapid decline, particularly in farmland, which is obviously relevant to this conference. Birds are in decline. I think the estimate is that bird populations fell in Britain by about 40 million between 1970 and 2010. We're on trajectory for a very bleak future unless we can find some pretty dramatic way of turning things around.
And what do you think has brought us to this point? What are the things we might see as the sort of landmarks leading us to where we are?
You mean what are the drivers?
Yeah.
Well, it isn't simple, but if you look at the patterns of decline, farming is clearly a big part of the story. The majority of Britain is farmed. And if you look at rates of decline of, for example, butterflies, farmland butterflies are faring much worse than any other category of butterfly. Farmland birds are also doing pretty poorly. moths, for example, are declining much faster in the south and east of Britain than they are in the north, which tallies with basically where intensive farming is mostly taking place. So broadly, the way we have this whole sort of food production system we've gone down, intensive industrial monoculture farming, has made huge chunks of the earth inhospitable to life.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, that for you, the intensification in monocultures, you would say is the driver. Is there anything else? I mean, your work's across the world, isn't it? So.
Yes, I mean, I think, of course, I agree exactly with what Dave said. He mentioned colossal number of bird species gone down in agriculture. Just think in this country of the numbers 40, 50, 60%. And let's not bother with the detail. That's about the loss over the last 50 years of any taxon that has been studied. You know, it might be 40% of birds, 60% of butterflies, 50% of bats or something. But the fact is about half of much of the biodiversity.
Just as an important thing to bear in mind is that most of these figures we started recording things in about the 1970s, but that's not to say that the 1970s was some pinnacle of biodiversity abundance. It was already 30 or 40 years into the declines, we would guess. Sorry, back to you.
Exactly. I mean, our baseline is not just shifting, it's plummeting. So, yeah, exactly. And I would add to that, and again, just reinforcing what Dave said, that when you ask about what are the drivers, it might be helpful to have in mind that these can be more or less immediate. You might say proximate or ultimate. And there's a whole host of things which, you know, could be climate change, it could be pollution, could be aspects of habitat loss that are the immediate drivers in a particular case study or problem. And all of them can add together, generally, additively. There's what lies behind all that, and I don't want to dodge the politically rather awkward point that it is a measure of the human footprint. It is consumption in an unsustainable way. So when we talk about the bits and pieces of the problem, let's not forget that we often end up thinking about and trying to treat symptoms rather than treat ultimate causes, which are, of course, much more challenging. And in that context, and might I offer a general thought for another minute? I think that research and the conservation community and the agricultural community over the last 50 years has performed miracles, absolute miracles, in understanding problems and trying to come up with solutions, winning, in many cases, some rather important battles. In my own case, I've been associated with battles that might be to do with the conservation of moths on farmland, or the conservation of water voles on rivers, or other stories overseas. But the analogy I like to draw is that however much ingenuity a community of people has brought to winning those battles, the war is going rather badly. So that knowledge that deals with a particular case study and at least slows down the problem might be thought of as a medical kit, which has become richer and more ingenious. The prophylactics are great. The needle and thread is super. The painkillers, just marvelous. It's a medical kit. But there's no bloody health service within which it should operate. There is no larger political understanding of the framework within which these solutions need to be applied. And I think that's as true in the UK as it is globally. So I think, what's the big picture answer? It's a difficult question.
So to pursue that for a minute, we've obviously talked about agriculture, but what are the things that we think are pushing agriculture to behave in the way that it does, the monocultures, the continually intensifying? What do we think stands behind that as the sort of spectres that are pushing us in that direction?
There probably are other people here better qualified than I and perhaps David to answer that. But I mean, essentially, I'm going to say things that I think people will already have heard many times before, that since probably the Second World War, perhaps earlier, we've gone down this route of trying to maximize production, where farmers are expected to produce as much as they can, and we actively encourage that for 50 years or more, with subsidies to rip out hedges and drain marshes and all these other things, which it then eventually emerged was obviously tremendously damaging for the environment. But you can't blame farmers for doing it. What the problem is, we don't seem able to disengage from that strategy. We're still of that mindset where production is more important than anything else, more important than whether it's sustainable in the long term, which is obviously foolish.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, just a slightly different way of saying the same thing. If your question is what has allowed us to get into this sort of mess, taking account of the huge number of people and the demands of equity that they should all have resources and therefore the human footprint, what has allowed us to get into this mess is false accounting. It is a failure to do full life cycle analysis on the costs and benefits of things, so that, as the economists would likely say, the externalities are ignored. That when we think of a given step in the environment, we don't think of the long-term downstream consequences, or classically, we are part of a global economic system that has not thought about those things. It has not taken into account the costs. People like us are professionally engaged in revealing some of those costs.
Absolutely. In adapting or dramatising Das Kapital for Radio 4, one of the things as a playwright that I'm always looking out for in drama are reversals, so where a plot sort of turns completely. And I've spotted that a lot in looking at Das Kapital and then looking back at the world. The idea in Karl Marx that one thing sort of swaps places with another thing. So the idea that we started off with commodities of one kind and another, and used sort of an exchange value, so money in the end, to swap commodities around, and that then we seem to have reversed that entirely. So rather than money being a stand-in for commodities, commodities have become a stand-in almost for money, and that perhaps extends itself, as you were sort of saying, into agriculture and that drive for productivity. We've talked a little bit about farms in relation to the world's wildlife, and I wonder if we could talk a little bit more in detail about what influence we think farms are having in particular areas on the world's wildlife, and whether we think, we've sort of said that agriculture is one of the greatest threats to wildlife. There's a quote, an Angela Leadsom quote when she was Environment Minister in 2016, saying it would make much more sense if those with the big fields do the sheep and those with the hill farms do the butterflies. And I wonder, just to take that as our starting point, whether you have any thoughts on that.
It's hard to know where to start with that one, isn't it? We've obviously got a dramatically different Environment Secretary now, but clearly it's impractical obviously, for example, many butterflies don't like to live in the hills, so that isn't going to fly, as it were. I personally am inclined to think that we should be looking for a food production system which works in harmony with nature, rather than trying to separate it and having industrial agriculture over a big chunk of Britain and then turning the rest into a big nature reserve. I think it's perfectly possible, and there are lots of organisations in the back of the hall doing all sorts of interesting things to develop ways of producing food that is sustainable and healthy and isn't drenched in pesticides and can work alongside having healthy wildlife populations. So that's where I would love to see us go. And maybe we'll return to that later on. But
we will. We'll get jollier towards the end. If it starts to feel a bit bleak, don't worry, you're not lost. David, what about you, particularly thinking of what you have seen in different parts of the world? Do you see a sort of division between sort of agriculture and our wildlife?
Well, I mean, in a moment, I suspect we'll get around to talking about some of the examples of things that both of us have worked on to illustrate that. But actually, a tiny bit of merit, and I find myself surprised to be saying this in the Andrea Leadsom remark, is it is at least a sort of challenge to say things needn't stay as things are. True. They can be changed. Think outside the box, think as radically, perhaps as ludicrously as you wish, but then have something to challenge and something to evaluate. And I think that to slightly twist that around, we should remember in Britain, in a moment we might talk about beyond the shores of this island, but we should remember in Britain that our environment, much though it has so much treasure, so much beauty, so much fascination in it, it is essentially a man-made environment. So when we talk about nature, we are not talking in this country about something that is primordial. That leads me, at least, to think that we're talking here exclusively about consumer, call it societal, call it political choices. What sort of countryside, what sort of farming system, what sort of society do we wish to have? If you had an altar which was naturalness, that is not going to help you in this particular case, because we don't have any naturalness, so we can decide what sort of countryside we want. Now, I think that due credit to Andrea Lettsom for thinking laterally for a moment, if not logically. We could imagine a farm gate which reflects the delivery of that farm to society, what society wishes. The farm gate might say, we have such and such a yield of wheat, we grow this variety of corn, and we have a tremendous volume of milk produced per cow per day. It might also say we have produced from our agri-environment payments so many skylarks or water voles or whatever, if that is what society requires of it. And it's our choice. It's very simple. I mean, there's no message from on high that things have to be the way they are. There's not even the altar of naturalness, as I say. Make up our mind as a society of what we want. And if people in this room don't like what society says is the answer, change it. Change it by argument and convincing people.
Absolutely. And thinking about some of the issues like pollution and the monocultures we talked about and habitat destruction, can you talk in a little bit more depth from your work about, in what ways we feel that our agricultural environments are really pushing against wildlife?
So, would you like me to mention the German study at this point? Which
you can do. We're going to come on to
you're going to come back to that later?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was just to look at those sorts of areas and just give us an image of that sort of relationship between the two.
Sorry, I'm not... Go on, David.
Yes, because I can't remember your question, I'll answer a different one. And I think I'll talk about scale.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Am I in trouble?
No, you're not yet.
Okay.
Not yet.
No. Okay. It seems to me that everything about thinking about farmland nationally, locally, nationally, and globally is about scale. And I mentioned at the beginning that I think a door opened for us in this sort of community with the maturity of the sciences of animal behavior and ecology. That is about a scale at the level of the individual. So imagine the hedgerow and the individual hedgehog ambling along it, or the individual butterfly deciding which plant it's going to feed from. Individual decisions in animals, and the way understanding those enables us to see how things work at a bigger scale, which could be, for example, the way a whole farm is managed, or how a farm fits into a wider landscape. So imagine a balloon, a hot air balloon, taking off, and your perceptions of the workings of nature change as you look at it from low down or high up. And with that thought in mind, I have 3 examples of different sort of things that we've worked on that illustrate how different scales of study can be useful. May I continue? Go. Starting pistol, gone. One is at a fine scale. And I have a quick story to tell you before getting to this. Years ago, 1987 in fact, we began working on field margins and also on the behavior of moths. And I want to tell you quickly as an aside why we did that, and perhaps we could all play this game later or as the conference unfolds. In 1986, myself and a very fine botanist who worked with me at the time called Helen Smith, some of you may know her, wondered what we could most usefully do to help farmers live alongside nature in the countryside. So for countless cups of delectable and oversweet tea, we sat in farm kitchens talking to farmers saying, look, we are, knotless threads of biologists trying to decide what to do that you might consider useful. Tell us what you need to know so that you can do your business better alongside wildlife. And out of that came the consensus view that if we understood better about the management of field margins to make them assets rather than the reservoirs of pests, we would have contributed something. That caused us to set up a very large scale, I think one of the largest scale long-term projects that there has been on this sort of thing around the field margins of Whiteham Farm, not far from here, where we had lots of replicated treatments. And it told us something about when is it from the butterfly's point of view, the spider's point of view, the pest species point of view, the bird's point of view, when is it advantageous to cut your field margins or not? When is it advantageous to plant them or not? Practical things that farmers needed to know. That was a minute scale, but it told us about individual processes and how they worked. Similarly with moths, we've tracked moths, individually painted moths with a tiny little bit of nail paint on them, and how they make their way along the corridors that are hedgerows or not on fields. So about connectivity in habitats. In exactly the same way, in different sort of farmland, we are now studying how lions make their way across Zimbabwe and Botswana using corridors with principles that are indistinguishable from those that take hedgehogs or moths or bats across the British countryside. So the lion example, I think, shows us at a different scale a way of letting agriculture and wildlife live together. Quick story. Lions live in national park. Very poor, potentially starving villagers live outside the national park with their handful of cows. The lions come out, they kill the cows. Somebody's livelihood is gone and eaten. Perhaps somebody's child is gone and eaten, by the way. This is serious in my backyard sort of stuff. And directly analogous to fox and poultry in this country. So we've fitted those lions with satellite collars. It enables us to know when the lion leaves the park. We've trained local community people from the Zimbabwean villages to be long shields. The shield protects the community from the lions. Each long shield has a mountain bike, a cell phone, and a GPS machine, which we have supported them to have. And so when the lion leaves the park, the satellite, very high tech, tells the villager where the lion is going. He uses his GPS to realize the farm to which the lion is going. He hops on his mountain bike to paddle off there, and he arrives there, gets the cows locked up, and then uses his fourth piece of equipment we've provided, which is a vuvuzela, a trumpet, to chase the lion back into the park. In that way, we have cut predation on cattle and allowed the farmers to be less disadvantaged by living with nature. At the same time, we've changed the farming system by providing each of the family farms who used to look after 2 or 3 cows each with a portable boma made of canvas. 100 cows from several families go in there every night. The lions do not attack the cows inside the boma. The cows do not run from the lions because of the canvas walls means they can't see the lions. So not only is predation further cut, the lions dung inside the boma. You move the boma, you plant your corn there. Remember, these people can starve in a bad year, and the yields of corn are doubled because of the dunging of the ground in which the cattle have been kept in the portable bomas. So not only is there less predation, there is more productivity. That is scaling up. And so having moved my story, and forgive me for taking too long, from Oxfordshire farmland and moths to lions in Zimbabwe, you see the same principles, the same way of thinking about looking after the well-being of wildlife and the well-being of the people that must live alongside it.
Thank you very much. It would be lovely if you'd talk to us about the German study that I stopped you talking about a few minutes ago. That would be brilliant. So you're okay. One of the authors of this study.
So I got involved. This story got a lot of coverage a few months ago when it was published. I was sort of dragged in to help analyse and write in English this study that was performed by a bunch of amateur German entomologists over the last 20-odd years, where they'd essentially just been sampling flying insect abundance with a thing called malaise traps, which look a bit like a tent, and flying insects just bash into them and then tend to walk upwards and fall into a pot of alcohol. These guys have been doing this since the late 1980s, all over Germany. And ended up with this really dramatic data set, which I guess they'd never had any idea what they were going to find when they did this. And I think they were largely doing the trapping out of personal interest in what interesting bugs they might find. But the long and the short of it is that if you weigh the daily catch of insects and look at how it's changed between 1989 and 2014, it's dropped by 76%. So the weight of flying insects buzzing through the air has reduced by a little over 3/4 in a 26-year period, right across Germany. We don't know for sure whether you'd have the same pattern if someone had been Malays trapping here, because nobody was Malays trapping here. But Germany is broadly similar in terms of the landscape and the way they farm and so on. And it tallies with the other data we have for butterflies and moths and so on from the UK. And it's pretty terrifying. A lot of people don't much care about insects, and I gave a radio interview about this study to a Canadian radio show, and the first question was, so the insects are all dying, that's a good thing, isn't it? And I didn't really know quite how to answer that. About 2/3 of all the species on Earth that we have named so far are insects, most of them flying insects. So if this German data is correct, we're rapidly losing most life on Earth. And of course that includes, flying insects includes all the pollinators. I'm sure you're all aware of how important they are to us. Roughly 1/3 of the food we eat relies upon pollinators to produce it. And it also, there are umpteen other insects that are important in recycling dung and as food for most other, the animals that David studies, all the many bats, birds, other mammals. If we lose the insects, then they've got nothing to eat. And we've seen really dramatic declines of things like spotted flycatchers, which are specialists in feeding on aerial insects, flying insects. So it really should be a warning that something absolutely dramatic is happening. This is not going to be a problem, in 50 or 100 years' time. This current rate of decline, so far as we can measure it, suggests that within a very short number of years, there'll basically be very little left of our wildlife, which is absolutely terrifying. It raises all sorts of interesting questions as to what exactly is driving it, and the study doesn't tell us that. It wasn't designed to it's not an experiment, it's just counting insects. It's not climate change. That's the one thing in the study does rule out, because when we analysed the data, we included weather, and weather explains a lot of variation from day to day in how many insects are flying about, but it doesn't explain any of the 26-year decline, because actually the climate hasn't changed that much yet. It's going to, and it probably will have all sorts of profound effects. But then that leaves us, okay, if it's not climate, what is it? Well, it brings us back to, so the way I interpret it is more based on my work on bees. With bees, it's pretty clear that their declines are due to a combination of things. It's habitat loss, there aren't any flowers anymore, or way fewer flowers than there used to be in the countryside, so there's no food for them. There aren't many places for them where they can nest undisturbed. They're affected by diseases, non-native diseases brought in with honeybees. We move honeybees around the world as domestic animals. And they're constantly exposed to a whole cocktail of pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, all sorts of things. And you stick those things together, and insects may be able to cope with one stress, but if they're hungry and infected with some foreign disease and being poisoned with several different toxins all at the same time, it's probably not surprising that they're disappearing. And my guess is it's pretty much the same for all of these flying insects. It's a combined stress from all these things. And ultimately, of course, they're all man-made stresses.
Yeah, and I did quite a lot of work on National Clean Air Day this year, looking at one of the things we were looking at was the rise in people suffering from asthma. And it's a similar story, really, that researchers would say, well, we don't know exactly what's causing it, but actually it's a combination of all these different things. So we're living in a very complex systemic time, aren't we, where there are a number of factors all influencing each other that has these quite dramatic results in all sorts of different ways. did you?
Yeah, well, it is very hard to tease apart, which factor is most important, and people like to see things simply. They want to blame everything on one thing that they can point at and do something about. And so, for example, pesticides often get all of the blame for bee declines, which is unfair. I'm not a fan of pesticide use. I think we use way too many pesticides. But clearly, the declines of bees aren't all due to pesticides. It's this combination of factors. But we've changed so many things so fast that wildlife just hasn't got a chance to evolve and adapt, because the world is changing, in the space of a short number of years, which is way too rapid for organisms to deal with.
Absolutely. So just we'll move on to look at sort of where we're at and how we might change things. But I wonder if either of you or both of you think there are any sort of green shoots of positivity that we can hang on to just through the next bit of the session, just things that we think where we are beginning to see elements of positive change, perhaps in small ways that might then be useful to scale up.
Well, back to my medical kit, where I think the green shoots are burgeoning. I mean, different ways of thinking, different sorts of ideas. You mentioned in the context of the German experiment, and you were talking about monocultures a moment ago and pesticides. I want to beat briefly, before answering your question directly, the drum of common principles. So, for example, in cereal fields in this country, the UK, we have radio tracked 200 wood mice, 17,000 locations of where each wood mice went. I challenge anybody in the audience to come up with a greater number of wood mice tracked. And we have found out from that the nature of the way they chart a course through those fields. At the same time, we are now tracking clouded leopards through oil palm plantations in Southeast Asia. It is the same problem, the same sort of solutions. But as to and that sort of information helps us formulate well-founded understanding, which leads to policy, which may lead to behavior change. Green shoot, here's an example. Another monoculture. Recently, we've been looking at leopards in Sri Lanka, which live in the most extraordinary monoculture, tea plantations. One tea estate, in a very warm way called the Dunkeld tea estate, has leopards in what is a complete monocultural carpet of green along the hillsides. Green tea, you'd think nothing left for nature. But the ridges, this is very steep hill country in the highlands, the ridges have a tiny frond of trees and woodland stretching analogous to hedgerows through British farmland. And a population of leopards lives on this farmland. It lives in those ridge caps where a small number of deer and wild pigs and so forth also live. The tea farmers like the idea of the leopards being there. The tea farmers are going into economic decline because of the market for their product and the labor costs of picking the tea by hand, which is part of their USP. And so now they want to conserve those leopards, but put a premium on the sales of their tea. It's called Dilmar tea, do buy some, called leopard-friendly tea. I think ideas of that sort to change the marketplace are an original way of thinking. I mean, by no means unique to that particular example. But who would have thought, if you said to me, or you did, give me an example of something interesting about farming and wildlife, probably leopards don't immediately come to mind. But the leopards in Sri Lankan tea plantations are as much a case of farming and wildlife as the water voles running through farms in this country. So there's a little green shoot.
Very nice. What about you, Dave? Is there anything?
There's lots of great stuff going on. I mean, this whole conference, in a sense, is about people thinking about alternative ways of alternatives to the sort of industrial farming paradigm. And my personal opinion is that actually there are lots of solutions. It would be relatively straightforward to produce more food than we currently produce in Britain off less land with way fewer pesticides. There are lots of simple ways of doing it. It probably involves more labor, getting more people back into farming, more small farms. And maybe, I hate to mention the B word again, but Brexit could be an opportunity to turn farming on its head. We've got this bizarre system where the taxpayer pays £3 billion a year to subsidise industrial farming. Why on earth do we do that? I've no idea. In theory, if we weren't constrained by whatever deal we hatch with the European Union, and if the government wanted to, which is obviously an enormous if, we could turn farming on its head. We could use all that 3 billion to fund sustainable small-scale farming, getting more people back into working the land, essentially do away with industrial farming as currently practiced. Wouldn't that be cool? But obviously, there's a few little hurdles.
Along the way.
Yeah.
We'll just do a couple more questions and then I'll open it up and hopefully we can have a bigger conversation with all of you. Why should we care? We've talked a little bit about it, but why should we care about our shrinking wildlife? Obviously, the caller in Canada thought it was a good thing. Why? Give us a few examples as to how selfishly we might care about it.
So, obviously there are two arguments usually rolled out to explain why we should look after biodiversity, and one is the sort of anthropocentric. What does biodiversity do for us? And of course, biodiversity does loads for us. We are part of biodiversity. We are part of nature. Although we like to buy our pre-packaged chicken breast in a polystyrene tray from the supermarket, it does actually come from an animal that had to feed on stuff that was grown in sunlight and so on. And we kind of forget that. Anyway, so biodiversity obviously does lots for us. It pollinates, again. It recycles nutrients and so that we can grow crops. It does umpteen things. It gives us lots of fish and all sorts. But I think it's really sad, and medicine's another obvious one, but it's really sad to measure everything in terms of what it does for us. And I think that will fail inevitably to protect quite a lot of biodiversity, because there are lots of creatures out there that actually probably don't do a fat lot for us. But I think it's really sad to reduce looking after the planet. The only reason is basically selfish. We live on this strange rock floating in space. For all we know, there's no other life out there. Who knows? But if there is any, it's a very long way away. So we should assume this is it. And we're lucky enough to share it with however many, perhaps 10 million species. Surely we have a kind of duty to look after them. They have as much right to be here as we do. So regardless of whether they pollinate our crops or do something else useful for us, we should respect them and leave them a bit of space, it seems to me.
Absolutely. I was very touched by your, when you talked about taking the point of view of a hedgehog trundling through the hedgerows. I don't suppose there are very many people who've spent time thinking about life from the point of view of a hedgehog. Is that something we should do more of and try being a bit less anthropocentric, do you think?
I think so, and you're nudging me down the same road that David just led us. To repeat, but briefly, of course there are utilitarian reasons, self-interested and survival reasons why we need nature. Nature, biodiversity, the word biodiversity seems to me to mean the cogs, the moving parts in nature on which the human enterprise depends. No cogs, no moving parts, game over for the most part. But nonetheless, the actually, for a while, rather productive notion that's prevailed amongst professional conservation biologists for 15, 20 years about monetizing nature to shove down the throats of politicians who failed to notice it, the incredible value that we all get from nature, while it's been healthy, is, as Dave says, simply not good enough. Because, at least in my personal view, because there are plenty of bits of nature which we probably, in all honesty, could do without imperiling our own position. And if you value, important word, value those parts of nature, then you have to think of another argument. Of course there's precaution. Maybe that tiny little creepy crawly that at the moment seems entirely insignificant will one day be the source of a new wonder drug. Better take care of it. Yeah, maybe, maybe not. But, there's so many bits and pieces of these working parts that we could probably get away without, that a purely utilitarian view, I think, will lead to ghastly losses. So I'm with you, and with the hedgehog, if I may say, in thinking we have to think about a value system which persuades people that these animals, these plants, these components of nature have an intrinsic value that is worth treasuring in itself. And that requires radical behavior change. It requires education or propaganda or whatever you care to say to change people's minds about what they value. And without that, I think the direction of travel of the supertanker is horrific.
I'd like to spend, obviously I know you'll have questions for Dave and David, but I'd like to sort of frame the last section of our conversation about a sort of vision for the future. So briefly to ask you to, what if we were to adopt the value system that you talk about and to care as widely as possible about our wildlife, what might our best future look like, and are there any pointers in terms of how we might get there?
Okay, so maybe I could flip that on its head and start with something which I don't think is the answer, which one thing which seems likely to happen is that the current agri-environment subsidy system, whereby a small amount of money at present goes to support biodiversity and a larger amount just goes for sort of land area-based payments. There's a lot of talk about making all of the subsidies, whatever the total sum is that we can afford post-Brexit, tied to some kind of delivery of environmental goods. And I'm all for that, but I think a lot of people think that will solve all of our problems, and I really don't think it will. Certainly so far, agri-environment schemes have utterly failed to stem the decline of biodiversity. And I think putting in a few more beetle banks and a few more flower strips, but carrying on farming the way we currently do is not the answer for me. I think the evidence suggests that is not going to make any real appreciable difference. So as I kind of touched on a minute ago, I think we need to be prepared to think of a really radical change. We need to forget this whole approach of having fields of... On the way here on the train, I was just sitting looking out the window at these bright green fields of either winter wheat or improved pasture, improved as in bugger all in it but ryegrass, and thinking what a bleak landscape it is. A lot of people think the countryside should look like that, but it's just because it's looked like that for 30 or 40 years and we've got used to it. I think we need, if you look at how much food you can produce in an allotment or in your back garden, it's astonishing. You can get 30 to 40 tons per hectare without any pesticides at all, just by growing fruit and veg alongside each other and weeding by hand and so on. It really isn't that difficult. There are currently 90,000 people on waiting lists for allotments, people who want to grow their own healthy, local, pesticide-free, in most cases, food, but they can't because they can't get hold of the land. And so maybe that, that's a starting point. We could, for the very first step would be to try and free up some land for those people to grow their own food as part of a kind of wider move towards getting more people back on the land, increasing small-scale local food production.
Yeah. David?
Well, I like Dave's vision, but rather than just repeat it for you, let me try a different one. Here we are, not very far from some dreaming spires. They're the habitat for thinking in a high-flown way about angels balancing on pinheads, and I want to bring us back to Earth with a bang. I talked a moment ago about valuing nature, but let me be clear, that was not from the position of saying to poor people, often starving people in difficult parts of the world, that they should carry the cost for something that we wish to indulge in. So there has to be a global scale system that enables all members of the human enterprise to live alongside nature in a way that at the moment we don't even approach. Now, I talked about scale earlier, so my vision for the future is more about a way of thinking than the practical delivery that Dave answered about. It's to say that we need to understand all these little bits in my oft-mentioned medical kit, all the ingenious ways of dealing with a particular problem. We need that sort of groundedness, that sort of earthiness. That's the basic science. But somehow we've got to get a lot better in the future, as I see it, at going all the way back up in that hot air balloon to look at national and international policy, into what I would call, probably misusing the word, geopolitics. All those things beyond biology that affect the decisions in the countryside, whether they're economics, international law, ethics, development, all of those different things that are part of a holistic system of making judgments. So the future for me is one where we burst out of our disciplinary cloisters into a sort of transdisciplinary world where we try and say, well, what economic, political, development, legalistic, and ethical systems would enable humanity in the 21st century to live more sustainably alongside wildlife. Now, of course, that is almost obscenely grandiose, and here I am in the comfort of Oxford pontificating when there are people who are starving and who have to make a living, and for whom wildlife in their backyard is a catastrophic nuisance. But I'm just saying, unless we can somehow move to a different way of thinking about how society works and how it's going to work with the 8, 9, 10 billion of us, then we cannot achieve the sort of outcomes that we're talking about. So I'm sorry if it's grandiose, but I think that's the big picture answer.
Thank you very much. So we've got probably just about 10 minutes just to open up to, 5 minutes, to open up to any questions. Let's take 2 or 3. So if we take the gentleman there, and then the young woman here, and then the gentleman over there. And obviously just be as brief as possible.
The Invertebrate Conservation Trust. I think one really positive thing is that insect declines are now in the public eye as they've never been before, and we've got political momentum and we've got public awareness that we've not had before. And Bug Life, we're obviously really keen to try to fix these declines, and Dave mentioned that they're complex declines, and they are. They're multifactorial. We can't expect the declines across 7,000 or 8,000 species to be down to one thing. Each one of those species actually has different causes as well. And Dave mentioned a number of the causes, all of which obviously I endorse: loss of wildflower areas, the problems with invasive species and diseases coming in. One thing he didn't mention, I wonder about with the study in Germany, because it was on nature reserves, so yes, there might be some pesticide effects in those areas, but they're not actually intensive agriculture, is the extent to which the phenomenon that we saw at Wicken Fen with swallowtails, when the wing sizes got smaller and smaller and they stopped flying when their habitats were fragmented. We do wonder at Bug Life whether there's a fragmentation effect here, that actually animals are no longer dispersing and moving as much as they did in the past, and that could contribute to declines perceived through malaise trapping, for instance. But also, if that is the case, we must think much harder about what we do with agri-environment in the future and how we restore the countryside, because that puts a completely different complexion on it. If this is about trying to get life to move through the countryside again and to restore those stepping stones, then we have to do meadow recreation in a stepping stone approach. We can't just take a random scattergun approach, because that's completely cost ineffective. And I just wonder whether you agree that we must be looking at restoring networks of wildlife habitats, particularly meadows, to get around this insect decline problem.
We'll take a couple more, and then I'll ask for your responses to those 3 points.
Hello. So my name is Joanna Metcalf, and I run a community interest company called Greener Growth, and I'm a member of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust and the permaculture lot. Anyway, so we go into prisons, schools and disadvantaged communities, and we teach people how to grow food and how to conserve nature, because fundamentally we wanted to find a way of introducing horticultural well-being, waking people up, getting them back outside. And I suppose what I wanted to say was, what we've learnt is there's a lot of people out there doing amazing things in lots of little pods all over the place. And the impact that we all want to have, and clearly lots of people do, is only going to work if we stop trying to compete for little pots of cash all over the place. And people that are doing something well are modelled, and we start doing it on a much wider scale, a bit like creating the green corridors. And also, the other thing just to say is it's very depressing for people, and a lot of people switch off when there's nothing but bad news. So what we do is we go into the schools and the prisons and say, look, there's a lot of bad stuff happening out there, and there's a lot of creatures being lost. But if every single one of us does the equivalent of what we do in the prisons, which is a backyard project, showing people how much biodiversity and how much food you can grow in a very small backyard, and planting bulbs when you put fruit trees in, so bulbs for the bees, and introduce all of these concepts in pint-sized chunks of good news, but also starting to teach people how to work together more effectively. That's the only way we're going to create the change that we all want to support.
Thank you. Let's take this gentleman's point here, and then you could answer any of those you feel like.
Neil Clark, I'm one of the volunteers here, but I'm off duty now. You rightly note, you talk about why we should care, and the two views, the anthropocentric view about what the biodiversity does for us, and also note the caution about that approach in terms of we should value things for themselves. Do you see the monetisation of biodiversity having any role in reversing the trends that we see?
So there were 3 points, and I don't know if you want to pick out any to respond to. First was sort of about the contribution of fragmentation. The second was looking at how we might be less fragmented in terms of how we work together and bring good news and energise people. And then finally, the role of monetisation. Anything at all?
The German study, as Matt said, was based on nature reserves. I didn't mention that, but it's an interesting point because these are protected areas. 1 minute left, crikey. I think there's a really worrying possible explanation for why these insect declines are happening on these nature reserves, which is that essentially it's an extinction debt. As you say, these are small nature reserves. It's very like Britain, surrounded by farmland. Those are isolated insect populations, which are essentially doomed. They're too small. They're not viable in the long term. And so they're just blinking out one by one as a result of habitat loss that may have taken place 30, 40 years ago. I don't know for sure that that's true, but it seems likely that that's part of the story. The other thing, of course, is these are flying insects. And if the nature reserve is surrounded by crops drenched in insecticides and they fly off the reserve, and of course the insect doesn't know where the nature reserve ends, then that may be part of the explanation as well. Sorry, I'm going to skip you completely because I just agree. Monetization, I hate the whole monetization, but I think maybe for some, you have to pick the argument that works best depending on who you're dealing with. And for some politicians, maybe the only thing they care about is money, so maybe sometimes it's useful. But I find it a soulless approach. Sorry.
Last words, David.
Well, 3 points all well made. I think behind Matt's point and some others, there was talking about fragmentation and the way the environment functions, whether the processes can still function even if the players on the stage are changing in their numbers and distribution. And I think dispersal, the way animals, plants move between bits and pieces of habitats, is one of the most difficult things to study, but one of the most important things to allow us to understand the working parts. And by the way, evidence into policy, into action, this booklet about farming and wildlife, which is meant for farmers, I'm hoping there are some of you in the audience, gives practical advice on what to do on the basis of the sort of research we've been talking about. So those of you who might use it, please do take one. Of course monetization is important. I mean, if monetization creates a self-interested argument for why we should preserve the environment, A, we don't want to commit suicide, and B, we want to use any argument we can get. But it isn't enough. That's the point that I think both of us are making.
Brilliant. That's time. Thank you very much. I'm sorry not to be able to take any more questions, but I guess maybe one or two of you will be around for a little while afterwards. Thank you very, very much for listening, and thank you to Dave and to David.